Picture Sheffield in 1980. The furnaces that have burned without interruption for a century are going dark, one by one, and the men walking out of the gates are walking out for the last time. They do not yet know that. Some of them suspect it. At its peak, British Steel employed 268,000 workers and produced 27 million tons of steel per year. It built the rails that crossed India, the girders that bridged 4 continents, the armaments that fought 2 world wars. It was not merely an industry. It was the material from which Britain had made itself. By 1980, the workforce had already been halved. By 2019, the company would enter insolvency for the second time in 3 decades. The name that had meant industrial permanence would be sold to a Chinese buyer for $50 million. This is the story of how Britain built the world's first industrial steel empire and then watched it disappear, decision by decision, decade by decade, until almost nothing remained. The forge of empire. Henry Bessemer invented the Bessemer process in Sheffield in 1856, and the world's relationship with steel changed overnight. The process reduced the cost and time of steel production so dramatically that what had been a premium material became a structural one available in quantities that could build cities, span rivers, and lay rails across continents. Bessemer was British. The process was British. The advantage, for a time, was total. By 1880, Britain produced more steel than any other nation on Earth. Sheffield's Don Valley ran for miles under a permanent haze of furnace smoke. Vickers, Cammell Laird, Brown Bailey among the great names lining the river. The industry built more than metal. It built communities, cultures, and a working-class identity organized entirely around the rhythms of shift work and molten steel. Steel underpinned empire in the most literal sense. The rails laid across India, the bridges crossing African rivers, the warships protecting trade routes, all of it began in Sheffield and Middlesbrough and Port Talbot. An industry that is dominant does not easily imagine its own vulnerability. It assumes permanence. And, in assuming permanence, it delays the investments that permanence actually requires. The post-war settlement in 1945, the incoming Labour government nationalized the steel industry, bringing the Steel Company of Wales, United Steel, and 13 other major producers under public ownership as part of a broader program of industrial reorganization. In 1951, the Conservative government reversed the decision and returned steel to private hands. In 1967, Labour nationalized it again, forming the British Steel Corporation from 14 companies merged into a single entity. The political oscillation across 22 years made long-term capital planning functionally impossible. Private owners would not invest heavily in assets that might be nationalized. Public managers would not commit to plant closures that might embarrass the government that owned them. Each change of ownership reset the planning horizon. While Britain debated ownership, West Germany rebuilt its steel industry with modern continuous casting technology. Japan constructed entirely new coastal steelworks through the 1960s. Lower costs, higher efficiency, equipment that had never aged. By 1967, when British Steel Corporation was finally formed, it inherited a fragmented collection of aging plants spread across too many locations, producing steel by methods that its competitors had already abandoned. 2 political philosophies competed for control of the industry. Neither prioritized the capital the plants needed. The 1970s crisis. The 1973 oil shock hit energy-intensive industries with a precision that more diversified businesses could absorb. Steel could not. British Steel's aging blast furnaces consumed fuel at rates that modern plants in Japan and Germany and South Korea did not. When energy prices doubled, the cost gap between British production and international competition widened from uncomfortable to unsustainable. Global steel overcapacity developed simultaneously. Newly industrializing nations added production capacity through the mid-1970s, just as established markets contracted. The price of steel fell, British Steel's costs rose. The arithmetic produced losses that accumulated quarter by quarter into a number that could no longer be managed at the margins. By 1979, British Steel was losing $8 million per day. The corporation employed 166,000 workers producing steel at costs no export market would bear, and no domestic customer was obliged to prefer. A 10-year modernization plan existed in documented form. The capital required to execute it had not been committed by any government of either party. The losses were the signal. The governments of the 1970s chose to absorb the signal rather than act on it. The decision to delay is always, in the end, a decision. It simply looks like patience until it doesn't. The Thatcher Reckoning. Ian McGregor was appointed chairman of British Steel in 1980 with a mandate that had not been stated publicly but was understood by everyone in the industry. Return the corporation to profitability. Do it by closing what cannot be made to work and concentrating what can. Between 1980 and 1984, the British Steel workforce fell from 166,000 to 71,000. 95,000 jobs eliminated in 4 years. The Consett Steelworks in County Durham closed in 1980, a town that had organized its entire existence around steel production, lost its reason to exist in a single announcement. Corby, Northamptonshire, lost its steelworks the same year. Unemployment in Corby reached 30% within 18 months. The 1980 steel strike lasted 13 weeks. Workers fought plant closures they could not prevent against a management that had already done the calculation and a government that had already made the decision. Production concentrated on the survivors: Port Talbot, Scunthorpe, Teesside, Rotherham. The restructuring that the 1960s and 1970s had deferred arrived all at once. The human cost of doing it slowly over 20 years was paid rapidly instead, and the delay had not reduced the cost. It had compressed it. Privatization in 1988, British Steel was privatized and floated on the London Stock Exchange and valued at $2.5 billion. The company that emerged from privatization was unrecognizable against the one McGregor had inherited 8 years earlier. Leaner, more productive, internationally competitive for the first time in decades. The same tonnage produced by a workforce less than half the size of 1980. The productivity gains were real. So was the human cost that had produced them, distributed across specific towns and specific families in ways the aggregate figures did not represent. In 1999, British Steel merged with the Dutch company Hugovens to form Chorus Group, a pan-European steel producer with 66,000 workers across Britain and the Netherlands, and ambitions to compete at global scale. The merger made strategic sense on paper. Reality arrived almost immediately. Steel prices fell. The pound strengthened against the euro. British operations became comparatively expensive within the merged entity. Chorus began directing investment and production emphasis toward its Dutch facilities, where costs were lower and the currency did not work against them. A privatized British Steel that had survived restructuring was now absorbed into a European entity where British plants were no longer the priority. The logic had changed. The workers had not been told. The Tata acquisition. In 2007, Tata Steel of India acquired Chorus for $6.7 billion, the largest Indian takeover of a British company to that point. Tata's rationale was coherent: European steel capacity, established customer relationships in automotive and construction, premium product capability that Indian domestic production had not yet achieved. The acquisition was debt-financed. Tata took on $3.8 billion in borrowings to complete the purchase. The global financial crisis arrived within months of the deal closing. Steel demand collapsed as construction and automotive sectors contracted simultaneously across every major market. The debt that had seemed manageable at the peak of the cycle became a structural burden at the trough. Tata spent a decade managing losses across its British operations, periodically announcing potential closures, periodically receiving government assurances of support, periodically arriving at temporary accommodations that preserved employment without resolving the underlying economics. The Port Talbot plant in South Wales, with 4,000 workers and the largest remaining integrated blast furnace operation in Britain, became the focal point of each successive crisis. A company acquired at the peak of a cycle, immediately tested by the trough, managed by an owner whose primary steel interests lay 8,000 miles away in Jamshedpur. The distance was financial as much as geographic. Chinese steel, the dumping crisis. China produced 803 million tons of steel in 2015, more than the rest of the world combined, and substantially more than global demand could absorb. The surplus moved into export markets at prices that reflected Chinese government subsidy structures rather than production costs. European steel producers filed anti-dumping complaints with the European Commission. The process took years. In the interim, Chinese steel arrived in Britain at prices 40% below domestic production costs. Tata's operations at Scunthorpe and Port Talbot could not match those prices without absorbing losses on every ton sold. The losses accumulated. The British government's response was shaped by considerations that extended beyond the steel industry. China was an active and sought-after investor in British infrastructure, in nuclear power, in real estate, and financial services. Antagonizing Beijing over steel trade remedies carried diplomatic costs that Whitehall was reluctant to pay. The government resisted naming Chinese dumping with the directness the industry required. The steel workers of Port Talbot and Scunthorpe were, in this calculation, one variable among several. They were not the largest variable. That in 2015, Tata announced it was reviewing all UK steel operations. The language of corporate review is the language that precedes closure. The industry had heard it before. The Port Talbot crisis. In March 2016, Tata Steel announced it was putting its entire UK business up for sale. The 4,000 workers at Port Talbot faced the possibility that the plant would close within weeks if no credible buyer materialized. The Welsh government, the UK government, and the trade unions engaged simultaneously, each with different legal tools, different financial capacities, and different timescales for action. The pension liability attached to the British Steel pension scheme stood at $700 million. Every serious buyer that approached the process reached the same conclusion. The pension deficit made the numbers unworkable. The asset was inseparable from the liability, and the liability was larger than the asset. The Brexit referendum of June 2016 altered the immediate calculation. The pound fell sharply, making British steel exports marginally more competitive and temporarily stabilizing the crisis enough for a restructured arrangement to emerge. Tata retained the business. The pension scheme was separated from the operating company. Workers accepted changes to future benefits in exchange for the preservation of current employment. 4,000 jobs were preserved. The pension scheme, covering 130,000 members, was restructured under terms that reduced what those members would receive. The plant continued. The future remained unresolved. British Steel's second death, the Scunthorpe operations, separated from Tata during the 2016 restructuring, were sold to Greybull Capital for $1. The private equity firm rebranded the business British Steel Limited, the name returning after years of absence, and announced intentions to invest and modernize. The ceremony of the rebranding was considerable. The capital behind it was not. British Steel Limited posted losses through 2017 and 2018. The trading environment remained difficult. Energy costs were high. The market had not recovered to levels that made the Scunthorpe cost base sustainable without continued operational pressure. In May 2019, British Steel Limited entered insolvency. The official receiver was appointed. 5,000 workers at Scunthorpe and associated sites faced immediate uncertainty about wages, pensions, and whether the plant would operate the following week. The proximate cause was a $120 million liability related to European carbon emission permits. Complications arising from Brexit uncertainty had prevented the permits from being transferred in time. In August 2019, Jingyi Group, a Chinese steel company, acquired British Steel for $50 million. The name that had been restored in 2016 with ceremony and promise lasted 3 years. It was sold to a Chinese buyer for less than the cost of 1 week of peak production. The human geography of Lost Sheffield's Don Valley, once visible for miles under furnace smoke, is now retail parks, apartment developments, and occasional heritage markers explaining to visitors what used to stand there. The explanation requires a sign because nothing visible remains. Consett lost 10,000 residents in the decade following the steelworks closure in 1980. Shops closed. Schools contracted. The social infrastructure of a working town, the clubs, the organizations, the rhythms of collective life organized around shift patterns, dismantled itself piece by piece as the people who needed it left or stopped needing it in the same way. Corby took 2 decades to rebuild around a different economic base. Besides Redcar Blast Furnace, closed in 2010, reopened in 2012, and closed permanently in 2015. 2,200 jobs removed in a single afternoon's announcement. The pattern repeated across every steel town with the consistency of a template. Plant closure, mass unemployment, population contraction, service withdrawal, a generation that leaves and does not return, the jobs that replace steel in retail, logistics, call centers did not carry the wages, the security, the identity, or the community architecture that steel work had carried. The aggregate employment figures eventually recovered. The aggregate figures were measuring something different than what had been lost, what Britain chose. The decline of British steel was not visited upon Britain by forces it could not have resisted. It was the accumulation of specific choices made across 7 decades by governments of both parties, by managers, by investors, and by trading partners whose priorities Britain chose not to contest. The choice not to invest in continuous casting technology in the 1950s and 1960s, when the capital was available and the competitive gap was still closable. The choice to nationalize and twice, making long-term planning impossible for any management team with any planning horizon longer than a political cycle. The choice to absorb losses through the 1970s rather than restructure at lower human cost while time remained. The choice to treat diplomatic relations with China as a higher priority than trade remedies for dumping. Germany retained a steel industry through the same period. It invested continuously, maintained an explicit industrial policy, and treated steel as strategic infrastructure rather than a market proposition to be optimized quarterly. The results are different because the choices were different. No single British decision was fatal in isolation. Each seemed defensible when made. Together they produced an outcome that was not inevitable, only consistent. The narrative of decline as destiny is itself a choice. It absolves the decisions that made it. Epilogue. Britain's steel capacity today stands at approximately 7 million tons annually against the 27 million ton peak of the post-war years. Port Talbot, the plant that survived every crisis across 4 decades, announced in 2023 that its blast furnaces would close, replaced by an electric arc furnace producing significantly less steel with significantly fewer workers. The transition is real technology. The reduction is also real. British Steel at Scunthorpe continues under Chinese ownership, periodically requiring government intervention to remain operational. The electric arc furnace at Port Talbot will require scrap steel as feedstock, and Britain's reduced manufacturing base generates less scrap than the furnace will need. The country will import the raw material for its own steel production. Sheffield still calls itself the Steel City. The signs are on the motorway approaching from the south. The furnaces that justified the name are not there when you arrive. The country that invented the Bessemer process, that laid the rails of empire, that armed 2 world wars from its furnaces, now imports the majority of the steel it consumes. The knowledge was British. The decision to stop applying was also British. An industry can survive foreign competition, recessions, and technological change. It cannot survive a country that has quietly decided it is someone else's problem. The cost of deferring difficult decisions is never avoided. It is only transferred to a later date, a different workforce, a town that had no vote in the matter. Germany kept its steel industry. Britain kept its arguments about who should own it. The difference in outcome followed from the difference in priority. A nation that forgets what it is made of will eventually have to buy it back from someone who remembered.